My name is Joe Carver. I'm 39 years old. I live in Sunnyside, Queens, in a two-bedroom apartment that I share with a border collie named Frank, who was supposed to be temporary and has now been with me for 4 years. I take the 7 train to work most days, unless the job is in Manhattan and I need to bring more equipment than the subway allows, in which case I take the van. I own the van. I own very little else of significance, which is not a complaint. It's an accurate accounting. I've been doing roofing and weatherproofing on high-end residential and commercial buildings in New York City for 13 years. Not the kind of roofing you see advertised on highway billboards. The kind that requires detailed knowledge of building envelope systems, thermal bridging, drainage design, and the specific way that different materials behave when you stack them 40 stories above the street and expose them to a decade of freeze-thaw cycles and wind load. I hold certifications most of my clients couldn't name. I have worked on buildings that won architecture awards. I have fixed problems created by architects who won architecture awards and then failed to think carefully about what happens to their beautiful details when water finds them. I have never, in 13 years, had a formal complaint filed against me by a resident or a client. This matters to me. Not because I need to be liked, I have Frank for that, and Frank has extremely low standards, but because I take the work seriously, and I take the people around me seriously, and the two things are related. The job on the Forsythe Penthouse started on a Tuesday in September. The building was a 42-story luxury residential tower on West 72nd Street, the kind of address that shows up in real estate listings with phrases like coveted and white glove service, and photographs of lobby arrangements that cost more than my monthly rent. The property management company had contacted us 3 weeks earlier about water infiltration on the penthouse terrace level, a slow leak that had been appearing intermittently behind the living room curtain wall during heavy rain events. I had done the preliminary inspection myself 2 weeks prior, which is how I work. I don't send someone else to look at a problem and then show up to fix it. I go twice, once to understand it and once to solve it. The preliminary told me what I expected. The terrace-level roofline seal had been improperly lapped during a renovation that had been running on the penthouse for the better part of 6 months. Someone had installed new parapet flashing without properly integrating it with the existing membrane, which meant water was tracking horizontally under the cap and finding the curtain wall anchor points. A slow problem. The patient kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it has already been doing damage for a season. I submitted my scope of work. The property manager approved it. We scheduled the fix for Tuesday through Thursday of the 3rd week of September. I was on the terrace by 7:15 Tuesday morning, which is when I prefer to start, before the building wakes up and foot traffic becomes a variable. I had one crew member with me, a guy named Pete, who has worked alongside me for 6 years and who communicates primarily in hand signals and coffee. We had the equipment staged and the access points confirmed with building management before any resident on the upper floors would have reason to be out on their terrace. At 9:40, the glass door to the penthouse terrace slid open. The woman who stepped out was wearing a silk robe and the expression of someone who had been awake for less time than her day had already demanded of her. She was probably 50, the kind of 50 that had been maintained carefully and expensively, with the posture of someone who owned things and knew it. She looked at me and Pete and the equipment array on her terrace the way you look at something you find in your refrigerator that you don't remember buying. "What is this?" she said. Not to me specifically, to the air. "Roofing repair," I said. I straightened and looked at her directly, the way I always do. "Joe Carver, from Carver Building Envelope. The property manager authorized access. We're here to reseal the parapet flashing on the north face. That's the source of the water infiltration you've been seeing behind the curtain wall." She looked at me for a moment. Her eyes moved to my boots, to my tool belt, to the rolled membrane material stacked along the parapet wall, then back to me. "Nobody told me anyone would be on my terrace," she said. "The authorization was sent to the unit owner last week," I said. "If there was a communication issue, I can have the property manager call you directly to confirm. We can also come back if today doesn't work, but I'd want to note that the infiltration point is going to be active in any rain event, and the forecast has precipitation Thursday." She looked at me again. Not at my words, at me. The specific way some people look at you when they are trying to decide what category you belong in and finding the categories insufficient. "I don't want workmen on my terrace while I'm home," she said. "Understood," I said. "I'll coordinate with the property manager to find a time that works. We can be flexible. I thought that was the end of it. I started making a note in my phone to call the property manager when we got downstairs. She went back inside. The glass door slid shut. Pete looked at me. I shrugged. We started packing the immediate work area so we could come back without leaving anything unsecured on the terrace. My phone rang at 11:15. It was my supervisor at the contracting firm, a man named Dennis who I have worked with for 8 years and who generally calls me only when something has happened that he doesn't want to handle by text. "Joe," he said, "we've got a situation." The resident of the Penthouse, Diane Forsythe, as I would later learn her name, had called the property management company's main office and filed a formal complaint. The complaint stated that she had been made to feel unsafe and uncomfortable by a workman on her terrace, who had been aggressive and who had not properly identified himself or his purpose. I stood in the lobby of the building and listened to Dennis read me the complaint summary. Then I read it myself when he sent it over. I had been polite. I had introduced myself by name and company. I had explained the work, offered to reschedule, and left without argument when she indicated she wanted us off the terrace. There had been no aggressive exchange. There had been no exchange at all beyond what I described. But complaints have weight, regardless of their accuracy. The property management company asked that I personally be removed from the job pending a review. Dennis, who knew me and knew my record, was apologetic and also clear. The building had a contract relationship with the management company, and the management company had made a request, and his hands were not entirely free. I told him I understood. I said I would not make it difficult. I drove the van back to Queens and took Frank for a long walk along the waterfront, which is what I do when I need to think without deciding anything yet. I was not angry in the way people expect anger to look. I was something quieter than that. The specific kind of tired that comes from having the same moment happen enough times that you recognize it before it finishes. A woman in a silk robe had looked at a man in a tool belt on her terrace and decided he was a threat. Not because of anything he said, not because of anything he did, because of what he looked like and what he was doing there, and the conclusion those two things produced in her before she asked a single question. I had been removed from jobs before, not often, but the feeling was the same each time. Not of injustice exactly, because I am old enough to know that injustice is too large and impersonal a word for a thing that is really just one person's small, confident mistake about who you are. I went home. I ate dinner. I walked Frank again. I went to sleep. On Wednesday, Dennis called to tell me the review would take several days, and that in the meantime, another crew member would attempt to complete the repair. I told him I had documented the scope fully and left written notes, and that the crew should follow them exactly or the repair wouldn't hold. He said he would pass that along. On Thursday morning at approximately 9 a.m., I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Frank was eating and I was watching him because I find it calming, which is something I don't tell people. It was the property manager. Not the one I had been coordinating with on the job. The building's general manager, a different person, a woman named Kessler who I had spoken to briefly during the preliminary inspection. "Mr. Carver," she said, "I want to update you on the situation. Something has come up that I think you should know about." What had come up was this. The city's Department of Buildings have conducted a scheduled inspection of the Forsythe Penthouse renovation project on Wednesday afternoon. The renovation, a complete interior gut and rebuild that had been running since March, had been operating under a series of permits that had lapsed and been improperly renewed. The contractor running the interior job had submitted an amendment to the original permit scope without pulling the required additional permits, which meant that several months of interior work had been done in a state of technical non-compliance. The DOB inspection had flagged multiple items, including the parapet and roofline work, which fell within the scope of the exterior envelope and therefore connected directly to what my crew had been sent to repair. The roofline Sela had identified and been preparing to fix, the improperly lapped flashing that was causing the water infiltration, had been documented by the DOB inspector as an incomplete finish point from the renovation contractor's scope of work. The renovation contractor had not disclosed this in their permit application. They had, in fact, listed the roofline work as completed. It wasn't completed. I had seen it with my own eyes 2 weeks earlier. I had documented it with photographs during the preliminary inspection, as I always do. Those photographs, along with my written scope of work, were now being requested by the property management company as part of the DOB review. The interior renovation. Diane Forsythe's 6-month undisclosed budget gut rebuild had been paused pending resolution of the permit compliance issues. Work could not resume until the roofline was properly finished and inspected, because the roofline was part of the original permit scope that the renovation contractor had claimed to complete, which meant the renovation could not move forward without the work I had been pulled from the job for starting. Kessler did not say any of this with any particular tone. She was matter-of-fact, professional, the way good facility managers always are. She told me the property management company was formally rescinding the removal request and asking if I was available to return to the job the following Monday with my full documentation. I said I was available. I asked her before we hung up how Ms. Forsythe was responding to the situation. There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds. "The unit owner has been informed," Kessler said carefully, "that the inspection findings are directly related to work she requested be halted." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table for a moment with Frank's chin on my knee, which is where he puts it when he can tell I'm processing something. I did not feel the thing people call vindication, exactly. Vindication implies that the point was ever in question, and what I do and who I am was never in question. Not to me. What I felt was something smaller and more specific. The particular quiet that comes when a structure behaves exactly as you knew it would, because you understood it correctly from the beginning and waited. I thought about Diane Forsythe in her silk robe, looking at me on her terrace. I thought about the specific confidence of her discomfort, the certainty that her assessment of the situation was accurate, that a man who looked like me, doing work like mine, in a space like hers, was something to be managed rather than heard. I thought about the water that had been tracking under her parapet cap for months, while nobody called it what it was. A problem created by the very renovation she had commissioned, finishing to a standard below what the permit required, certified as complete by a contractor who had decided she would never know the difference. Water doesn't care about aesthetics. It doesn't care about addresses or silk robes or who files complaints about whom. It finds the path of least resistance and it goes there, quietly, until someone who understands it shows up and reads it correctly. I showed up. I read it correctly. I was removed before I could finish, and then the structure told the truth anyway. The way structures always do, because you cannot file a complaint against physics. I went back the following Monday. Pete came with me. We were on the terrace at 7:15. The glass door remained closed. We completed the repair in 1 day, properly this time, with no interruptions, and I documented every step as I always do, with photographs and written notes that will exist in that building's records long after anyone involved has moved on. I did not see Diane Forsythe. I didn't expect to. The property manager Kessler came up at the end of the day to confirm sign-off. She was efficient and professional, and before she left, she said, without editorializing, "Your preliminary documentation was the most complete record we had of the roofline condition. It made the DOB review significantly cleaner." I thanked her. On the way down in the service elevator, Pete looked at me. I said, "Don't." He held up both hands, said nothing. The elevator descended. Outside, the city was doing what the city does. Loud and indifferent and continuing. I loaded the van. Frank had been at my neighbor's for the day and was waiting with the particular intensity of a dog who believes he has been abandoned and forgiven at the same time. I drove home. I ate dinner. I walked Frank along the waterfront. And I thought about what my first boss told me, back when I was 24 and new to this work and still learning how to read a building before I opened my mouth about what was wrong with it. He said, "The building always knows. You can misread it, ignore it, paper over it, certify it incorrectly. But the building holds the record, and eventually, somebody who knows how to read it is going to show up." I have built my entire working life around that principle. I show up, I read it correctly, I document what I find, and I do not make myself smaller to fit into the category someone else has prepared for me. If you've ever been that person, the one in the room who gets assessed before they speak, who gets removed from a conversation before it starts, leave a comment below. I read every one. And if you know someone who does honest work and carries it without complaint, share this with them. They deserve to hear that the building always knows. See you in the next one.